My name is Emily Parker. I'm 32 years old, and for the past few years my family has loved to call me the forever renter behind my back and sometimes right to my face, which is exactly why this video is titled, My Sister Called Me a Forever Renter. 2 years later, she discovered what I was really building. If this story is already hitting a nerve, hit subscribe, drop a like, and stay with me, because by the end you'll see why that label became my greatest weapon instead of my biggest shame. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from so I know who's sitting at this messy family table with me tonight. I'm not some millionaire. I don't come from money, and I don't live in a fancy high-rise. I rent a small, quiet 2-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a permanent smell of burned toast in the hallway. On paper, it looks like I'm behind in life compared to my older sister, Olivia, who loves to brag about her big suburban house, her stainless steel appliances, and her perfect little backyard she never actually has time to use. What my family didn't know, and what I never corrected them on, is that while they were laughing at my rent receipts, I was quietly turning discipline and spreadsheets into something much bigger than a white picket fence. The night everything changed started like any other Sunday dinner at my parents' place. Overcooked roast, too many opinions, and not enough listening. Olivia showed up in a brand new SUV, my mom gasped like a teenage girl at a boy band concert, and my dad shook his head the way he always did when he looked at me and my tiny apartment life. I walked in with a cheap bottle of red wine and a secret that had been growing, brick by brick, for 2 full years. But that night, one comment from my sister pushed me so far that I finally decided to let them all see exactly what I'd been building behind the scenes. Sunday dinners at my parents' house have always felt less like a family gathering and more like a weekly performance review, with Olivia as the star employee and me as the one with potential if she just got serious. My mom sets the table, my dad turns on the game in the living room, and Olivia walks in acting like the house, the car, and even her kids' private school tuition are all part of one big personality trait. I sit there, smiling politely, listening to the same stories about interest rates, countertops, and equity, even though no one ever asks what I'm doing with my life beyond. So, are you still renting? That night, while we were passing the mashed potatoes, Olivia looked at me and said, "You know, Em, at some point you're going to have to grow up and stop throwing money away on rent. Don't you get tired of paying someone else's mortgage?" She laughed. My mom did that awkward half smile she does when she agrees but feels guilty, and my dad cleared his throat like he was trying not to join in. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed and leave a like if you've ever had to sit through a conversation where people judged your entire life based on one shallow detail. I could feel my face getting hot, but it wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was anger that had been building for years, layered with every little comment, every joke, every backhanded compliment about how, at least, I seemed responsible with my little renter budget. I wanted to slam my hand on the table and say, "Olivia, you literally can't afford the house you're flexing." But I kept chewing, staring at my plate, replaying numbers in my head instead of their words. Because the truth was brutal and ironic. The same sister who mocked me for renting was only still living in that house because someone else had been quietly covering the part of her mortgage she could never actually pay on her own. And that someone was me. 3 years before that dinner, when Olivia first bought her dream house, things were very different between us. She called me sobbing one night, saying, "Em, if I lose this house, I lose everything. My image at work, the kids' school, all of it." Before I go on, if you've ever been the quiet one holding everything together in your family, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and stay with me, because you're going to recognize yourself in what I'm about to say. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge or pride. I was thinking about my niece and nephew, and how terrified they must have been at the idea of moving out of the only home they knew. Olivia had overextended herself on the mortgage, the cars, and the private school tuition, all to keep up this picture-perfect image of success that our parents adored. What my family didn't know is that the bank had already given her a final warning, and she was one missed payment away from losing the house she loved to show off at every holiday. I remember sitting at my tiny kitchen table, laptop open, looking at my savings and my investment accounts, knowing that I could help her, but it would slow down everything I was building for myself. I said yes anyway, under one condition: no one, not even our parents, could know I was helping. From that month on, every time Olivia posted a smiling photo in front of her house with a caption like, "Hard work pays off," there was a quiet transfer leaving my account that made sure the bank wouldn't knock on her door. I kept renting, took the jokes, and watched her soak up the praise for being the responsible sister who had it all together. It was like being the ghost investor in someone else's life, funding a show I never got credit for, while my own story was reduced to, "She just doesn't like responsibility." I told myself I was doing the right thing for the kids, But a part of me knew this secret was going to explode someday, and when it did, nothing in our family would look the same again. People always assumed I rented because I couldn't afford anything better, like I was stuck at the bottom, waiting for my real life to start once I finally bought a house. The truth is, I sat down years ago with a notebook, a calculator, and way too much coffee, and I ran the numbers over and over again. Buying a home in my city would have meant a massive down payment, crushing monthly costs, and being locked into one place just to impress people who never bothered to ask what I actually wanted. Renting wasn't my failure plan, it was my strategy. While Olivia was chasing granite countertops and a backyard big enough for Instagram photos, I was focused on something completely different: freedom and quiet growth. I tracked every dollar, built an emergency fund, and started investing in small rental properties in cheaper markets. Nothing glamorous, no mansions, just simple places that could generate steady income. I used my so-called wasted rent years to avoid being house poor and to buy assets that didn't have my name on the mailbox, but did have my name on the contracts. To everyone else, I was just the sister who hated commitment. But in reality, I was more committed to my long-term peace than to anyone's expectations. In my head, I had this image. Olivia was proudly buying the front of the store, the display, the shiny sign, the part everyone could see, while I was quietly buying the stock in the back room. She had the showroom life, and I had the inventory no one noticed, but that's what actually kept everything running. I knew that someday, when life stopped being polite and the bills started screaming, the difference between our choices would finally show. And as harsh as it sounds, a small part of me was waiting for the moment when my forever renter label would crash into the reality of what I had really been building all along. Saying yes to helping Olivia felt noble at first, but over time it started to feel like I was paying rent on two lives, mine and hers. Every month, I'd sit at my tiny kitchen table, open my banking app, and watch a chunk of my hard-earned money disappear into a mortgage for a house I didn't live in and wasn't welcome to take credit for. If this is hitting close to home, and you've ever been the responsible one who quietly fixes everyone else's mess, make sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and stay with me, because what came next is where everything truly shifted for me. The emotional cost was heavier than the financial one. I'd hear my parents brag about how stable Olivia was, while they told me, in the same breath, that I should be more like her and finally settle down. I'd drive back to my rented apartment, unlock my slightly crooked front door, and sit on the couch in the soft hum of my old refrigerator, wondering how they could be so blind to what I was actually doing. It wasn't just about the money, it was about carrying the weight of someone else's fantasy while being treated like I had none of my own. That's when something inside me started to harden, not into bitterness, but into boundaries I knew I'd eventually have to enforce. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself, if they knew the truth, would they treat me any differently, or would they just expect more? That question haunted me every time I saw Olivia post another picture of her blessed life with a caption about hard work and perseverance. I thought about my future, my goals, and how long I could keep playing the role of silent savior without completely losing myself. Deep down, I knew the situation had an expiration date, and when it arrived, the fallout would be impossible to ignore, for all of us. While part of my money was quietly propping up Olivia's lifestyle, the rest was working just as quietly for me. I didn't talk about it at family gatherings, I didn't brag about it online, and I definitely didn't try to prove anything to people who had already decided I was behind. Instead, I spent late nights reading, watching videos, and running numbers, learning how to buy small rental properties in more affordable towns, how to partner with local managers, and how to turn boring, consistent cash flow into my real safety net. Before I go deeper, if you're the kind of person who prefers building in silence instead of showing off, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. This part of the story is exactly for you. My first place wasn't some glamorous condo. It was an old duplex in a not-so-pretty neighborhood 3 hours away, with peeling paint and a yard that looked like it had given up years ago. But the numbers made sense. The rent covered the mortgage, plus a little extra that I could roll into the next deal. A year later, I added a small single-family home, and then a tiny condo near a college campus, each one boring on the outside but powerful on my spreadsheet. While Olivia showed off her one giant fragile house, I was slowly stitching together a safety net made of multiple modest doors that no one in my family even knew existed. I started to view my rented apartment completely differently, not as proof that I'd failed to grow up, but as my headquarters, my command center. The thin walls and outdated kitchen didn't bother me as much when I remembered that my real wealth wasn't sitting under my feet. It was spread across different roofs with tenants whose rent fed my future, not my ego. Every time someone joked about me wasting money on rent, I bit my tongue and reminded myself that they were looking at the stage, not the backstage. What I didn't realize then was that life was already setting the scene for the moment, when my quiet, boring decisions would collide with Olivia's loud, unsustainable ones. And that collision would change everything. The first real crack in Olivia's perfect house fantasy showed up as a casual comment over coffee one afternoon. She laughed and said, "Ugh, the bank keeps calling about some silly review thing. They're so dramatic." But her eyes flicked away just a little too fast. I stirred my drink, pretending not to notice, but my stomach tightened because I knew banks don't just call for fun. They call when something is off. That night, alone in my apartment, I replayed her tone in my head and wondered how bad things really were behind her staged smiles. Over the next few months, little clues started to pile up like unopened mail on a counter. Olivia mentioned pausing some activities for the kids, complaining more often about how expensive everything is lately, and joking that she might need a second job just to keep up with this glamorous life. At the same time, the amount she asked me to transfer crept up, always with a rushed explanation and a promise that it was just for now. I kept telling myself I was helping her over a bump in the road, but at some point, a bump starts to look a lot like a cliff. I remember one specific evening when she called me from her car, her voice echoing slightly like she was parked in some empty lot. Can you help me out just this once more? I swear, after this, I'll be fine," she said. And something about the way she emphasized this once made my chest feel heavy. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was realizing she had started to treat my sacrifice as just another line item in her budget. That was the night I finally admitted to myself that this wasn't a temporary favor anymore. It was a system, and I was the one funding it. The night I hit my limit, I was sitting on my couch with my laptop open, ready to make yet another transfer to cover Olivia's shortfall. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for the first time, instead of logging into my bank, I opened a spreadsheet with all my properties, all my accounts, all my goals. I stared at the numbers and realized how much further ahead I could be if I hadn't been patching holes in a ship that someone else kept drilling into. My chest felt tight, but beneath the anxiety, there was this small, steady voice whispering, "You're allowed to stop." I thought about my future, the trips I hadn't taken, the upgrades I'd postponed, the extra property I could have bought if I wasn't busy funding someone else's illusion of stability. I pictured myself 10 years from now, still renting happily by choice, but drained and resentful because I never drew a line with my own sister. That image scared me more than any argument or guilt trip ever could. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and decided that this next payment would be the last one. No drama, no announcement, just a quiet, firm decision. When I called Olivia the next day, my hands were shaking, but my voice came out calmer than I expected. I told her I would help this one final time, but after that, she needed to adjust her life to what she could actually afford. There was a long silence, then a soft, annoyed sigh on the other end of the line, like I had just inconvenienced her by setting a boundary around thousands of my own dollars. I hung up feeling strangely lighter and heavier at the same time, not knowing that this decision would collide perfectly with the next Sunday dinner, and finally drag every hidden truth into the middle of the table for everyone to see. By the time that Sunday dinner rolled around, I was already carrying my decision like a quiet secret armor. One last payment, and then I was done funding Olivia's fantasy. I walked into my parents' house with that same cheap bottle of red wine and a calm I hadn't felt in a long time, knowing I had finally chosen my future over her facade. If you've ever had to choose between protecting yourself and keeping the peace in your family, hit subscribe, leave a like, because this is where everything finally blew up in the most unexpected. Dinner started the way it always did. My dad complaining about work, my mom fussing over the food, and Olivia taking center stage with stories about renovations and upgrades she wanted to do to the house. She joked again about me being the forever renter, saying, "At least one of us decided to be a real adult," and my parents laughed like it was just harmless sibling teasing. But then my dad casually mentioned a letter from the bank he'd seen on their kitchen counter earlier that week, something about serious delinquency and potential foreclosure, and the entire mood of the room shifted 1 degree colder. Olivia's smile froze for a split second before she tried to brush it off, saying the bank was overreacting and that she had everything under control, but my heart started pounding. I realized that while I had drawn my boundary, she had doubled down on the performance. My mom's eyes darted between us, confused, and my dad frowned in that way that meant he was finally connecting dots. In that tense, heavy silence, I felt it. This was the moment where either I kept swallowing the truth or I finally laid everything on the table. Money, resentment, and all. I don't know what exactly snapped inside me, but I remember putting my fork down and hearing the tiny clink like it was a gunshot. My voice came out steady, almost too calm, when I said, "If I stop paying, that house is gone in a few months." The room went dead silent. No clinking plates, no fake laughs. Not even the sports game in the background seemed to exist anymore. My mom blinked at me like she hadn't heard correctly, and Olivia's face drained of color in slow motion. My dad was the first to speak. "What do you mean if you stop paying?" he asked, his tone low and controlled in a way that made even Olivia shift in her chair. I took a breath and said the words I'd been holding back for 2 years. "I've been covering part of Olivia's mortgage every month so the bank wouldn't take the house." My mom's hand flew to her mouth, and my dad's eyes snapped to Olivia, then back to me, searching my face for any sign that this was some twisted joke. But there was nothing funny left in me about this situation. Olivia stammered, Why would you say that?" Like the problem was my honesty, not the secret itself. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and slid it toward my dad, showing him a long list of transfers with her name and the mortgage companies. "Because I'm done," I said quietly. The air felt thick, my heart was racing, but under all of that was something unfamiliar and powerful. The feeling of finally stepping out of the shadow and letting everyone see who had actually been holding up the roof this whole time. For the first time in my life, Olivia didn't have a smart comeback ready. She just stared at my phone, then at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a version of the story where she still looked like the hero. My mom whispered, "Emily, is this true?" in this fragile voice that made me suddenly realize how much she had wanted to believe the image she had of both of us. My dad's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the transfers, the dates lining up perfectly with all the times Olivia had bragged about handling everything on her own. When he finally spoke, he didn't yell. It was worse than that. "So all this time, you let us think you were doing this alone while your sister was paying to keep you afloat?" he asked Olivia, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disappointment. Olivia snapped back, "You don't understand. I was going through a lot." And Emily offered, "I didn't force her," clinging to the technical truth while completely ignoring the moral one. I could feel every old childhood wound resurfacing in that moment. The favoritism, the comparisons, the subtle way I had always been the less impressive daughter. Now they were all standing in the same room as the bank notices and my bank statements. My mom turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And for once I didn't shrink. "Because whenever I tried to set boundaries or do things differently, you made it clear that success looked like a big house and a mortgage," I answered. "You never asked what I was building. You only asked when I was going to buy." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't on my shoulders anymore. For the first time, everyone at that table had to sit with the truth about who had really been responsible and who had just been performing responsibility. My dad pushed my phone back toward me and turned to Olivia. "How far behind are you, really?" he asked, and this time there was no softness in his tone. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she admitted, in a small voice, that without my help, she was already months behind, and the bank had started the process of reviewing her for possible foreclosure. My mom gasped like the word itself was a physical blow, clutching her napkin so tightly it tore. I just sat there, strangely calm, watching the story they had all believed crumble piece by piece. Olivia tried to reach for sympathy, saying, "I was under so much pressure to keep everything going, to keep up the lifestyle everyone expected from me." My dad shook his head slowly and replied, "No one asked you to live in a house you couldn't afford. We did, however, spend years making your sister feel like she was less because she chose not to." Hearing him say that out loud felt like a crack in the foundation of our entire family dynamic. Olivia looked at me then, really looked at me, like she was seeing a stranger who had quietly become her lender, her safety net, and now, her final line of credit, all without asking for anything in return except honesty that she never gave. I spoke softly, but I didn't sugarcoat it. "Liv, I helped because I didn't want the kids to lose their home, but I can't keep burning my future to keep up your image," I said. "I've been called the forever renter for years, but the truth is, I own more roofs than you do. You just live under the loudest one." No one laughed. No one defended her. In that moment, the room finally caught up to a reality I had been living in alone for far too long. Owning one flashy house with no real stability isn't success, and renting by choice while quietly building assets isn't failure. It was the first time the lines between those two ideas were clearly, undeniably, redrawn. In the days after that dinner, something subtle but massive shifted in our family dynamic. My parents stopped making little comments about me finally buying a place, and started asking real questions about how I'd managed my money so well while still living a simple life. It was uncomfortable at first, having the people who once doubted me now looking to me for guidance. But it also felt like finally stepping into a version of myself I'd been quietly working toward for years. Olivia, on the other hand, couldn't hide behind the shiny version of her life anymore. She had to sit down with the bank, with a financial advisor, and with her own numbers, and accept that the life she'd been performing was built on debt, denial, and my silence. We had tense conversations, some with tears and some with angry words, where she accused me of embarrassing her, before eventually admitting she'd been terrified of looking like she'd failed. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The sister who'd been labeled a failure for renting was the only one who'd actually built something stable. As painful as it was, that shift created space for honesty we'd never had. My parents apologized, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough for me to feel seen for the first time, not just as the independent one, but as the one who had quietly carried more than anyone realized. And with that recognition, I felt free to say the words I'd never dared to say before. My life doesn't have to look like yours to be successful. That was the moment I truly took ownership of my story, instead of letting the forever renter label define it. In the months that followed, Olivia made some hard choices she should have made years earlier. She sold the SUV, downsized her expenses, and seriously considered selling the house to move somewhere she could actually afford. Watching her confront reality was messy and uncomfortable, but it wasn't my job to cushion every fall anymore. I had drawn my line, and for the first time, I stuck to it, even when she tried to tug at my guilt or nostalgia for the days when we were just sisters, not lender and borrower. What surprised me most was realizing how much peace there is in letting other people live with the consequences of their own choices. For me, nothing dramatic changed on the outside. I still rented my same little apartment with the crooked door and the humming fridge. But inside, everything felt different. I increased my investments, bought another modest rental property, and built my emergency fund higher than it had ever been. More importantly, I stopped making decisions out of obligation or fear of judgment and started asking one simple question. Does this move me closer to the life I actually want, or just closer to a life that looks good to other people? The answer guided everything. I also started talking more openly, with friends, online, and in spaces like this, about what it really means to build wealth in silence. Not the flexing, not the flashy, I made it moments, but the unglamorous discipline of saying no to things that would impress people for 10 seconds and yes to things that would protect me for decades. I realized there are so many of us who have been shamed for not fitting the script, no house, no ring, no perfect timeline, but who are quietly doing the math and choosing freedom over approval. And that's why telling this story matters to me. It's not just about revenge, it's about reclaiming the definition of success from people who never had to live with the cost of their own advice. Looking back, I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I should have set boundaries earlier. I should have been more honest with my parents about how their comments hurt, and I definitely should have put a clear time limit on helping Olivia. But if you asked me whether I regret renting instead of buying just to look successful, the answer is no. Every single time, no. Renting gave me flexibility, time, and freedom to build assets that actually work for me, not against me, and to stay light enough to walk away from situations that were draining me. If you're watching this and you've been labeled the failure, the late bloomer, or the forever renter, here's what I want you to hear. Your value is not measured in square footage, mortgage size, or how impressed your relatives are at Christmas. It's measured in how aligned your life is with your own values, how protected your future self is because of the choices you're making today, and how willing you are to set boundaries even when it makes people uncomfortable. Revenge doesn't always look like blowing up someone's life. Sometimes it looks like quietly outgrowing the version of yourself they decided you were, and letting the truth speak for itself when the time is right. After hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? Would you have helped your sister, or would you have walked away sooner? Do you think I was wrong for finally cutting off the financial support and letting her face the reality of her choices? Let me know in the comments. I read as many as I can, and I know a lot of people in this community have been through their own versions of this. If you want more stories like this, about revenge, betrayal, and taking your power back in ways people never see coming, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. And don't miss the next video, where I share an even crazier story about how being called irresponsible with money by my own mother ended with me refusing to finance her dream purchase and forcing her to realize who actually understood money in our family.